We'll just kind of roll, and Bob, you go ahead and
We'll just start. Let's start something a really crazy way. John, 8 years ago, whatever it was we met.
Yeah.
8 years ago, you were saying that apart from the fact that all the astrologers had to start getting scientific before you would have anything to do with them, also you thought that some people like William Lilly were going to have, and the Elizabethan or later astrologers were the key to a lot of the to any real new astrological work. Now what we're doing is we're going way beyond, much earlier. What's your reaction to that? What do you think?
Well, I think that you can't know. It just as when we talked about Cameron, when I said you had to know the people that had done the major structural work before you start pontificating about what it's about. If you haven't talked to the architect, don't start talking about how the building's built, because it's behind the plaster and you don't know. and what we're finding out now is how the building was built, and then we decide whether we want to make additions to it or just live with it as it is.
Do you agree with our claim that the Greek material is the foundation that we've got to start with? That's what all three of us are claiming here. So.
Well, it's certainly the oldest accessible. It would be nice if you had Neolithic text to come off of, but you don't. The Greek appears to be the oldest stuff that is in largely reproducible form, translatable form, although there are Egyptian and cuneiform stuff that is there to be had, but apparently it's not in as a thoroughgoing a format.
It doesn't even really look like it's astrology in the modern sense. It's not really what we think about as horoscopic astrology.
The oldest form of Mesopotamian astrology is largely stellar omen lore, and it includes things that would not be considered astrological at all now, such as the color of the moon when it rises, whether the moon is visible because of clouds during a certain phase, material of that sort. But in actual fact, the first horoscopic astrology is in cuneiform, although it does not appear to have been very thoroughly worked out at the time, at least from the documentary evidence. It's undoubtedly true that the symbolism has its impetus from the Mesopotamians, but the enormous expansion of technique and method appears to be Hellenistic Greek.
And besides, we live in a Greek-driven world. I mean, that's what our philosophy is, that's what our system of thought is, so it's almost as if it wouldn't even matter if there had been anything before that.
Well, the Mesopotamian stuff is particularly interesting from the point of view of mundane astrology. The stuff that's in the British Museum, to which you're alluding, has an awful lot of material empirically correlating political, meteorological, and agricultural events with celestial events. That stuff might really be very interesting at some point to take a look at, but what you're really going to be looking at is the origins of what we're addressing initially. I mean, the kickoff point for anything that we call astrology or horoscopy really is the Greek material.
Yeah, but we keep getting people saying, well, we know that astrology goes back 10,000 years. It's pre-Atlantis. It's all this kind of thing. We keep getting responses like that.
Well, at some level, that statement is defensible. In that correlation of celestial events with human events is actually datable back to 30,000 years. We're talking about scratches on animal bones.
Yeah, the original lunation scratches.
Exactly. But the idea of erecting a map of the heavens with respect to a certain time and place for an individual is a much more recent idea. And when people talk about the antiquity of astrology, they tend to be talking about this older kind of astrological general correlation, not about the specific horoscopic kind. The horoscopic kind, as best as it can be dated from current material, is 400 BC roughly.
What people forget usually, I think, is the capability of the astrologer, the capability of anybody on any particular issue. And while it's one thing to say that the concept was around, that there was a correlation between what went on in the sky and what went on Earth, and you see this, for instance, in the Neolithic stuff you referred to, and then you see it more developed in the Babylonian stuff. You don't see the mathematical methodology for doing anything approximating what we do until you get to the Greeks, really. The Greeks are the key figure there.
As a matter of fact, the Babylonians, or I should say the Mesopotamians, since there are all kinds of different peoples, the Mesopotamians can be regarded as having gathered the empirical base and also perfecting a planetary technique which was capable of doing horoscopes. But this did not happen until the very end of the Babylonian period, about the time of the Alexandrian conquests. So it's as if the Babylonians did the research and the Greeks did the thinking.
Well, it's also something that is oddly separate from the horoscope that the horoscope came to be associated with, which is the concept that the beginning of something was critical to its entire development later on, which is utterly separate from associating with the heavens.
Right.
And I mean, the Greek phrase, the beginning is half of everything, which now has turned into well begun, half done, is something that mariners are incredibly superstitious about, who know nothing about horoscopes or anything else. But they know that the inception point of any given action affects everything entirely down the line. And the association with that of the universal situation at that point and interpreting what the aspects of that universal situation was a mating of two totally separate ideas, and that appears to have happened in Greece.
Or the Hellenistic world, yeah. A point that has to be brought out very strongly here is that, and I don't think this is a controversial point among us, but it should be made clear to people watching this tape. When we say Greek, we don't mean people who inhabited the Greek peninsula and the shores of Asia Minor. We mean people whose international language was Greek, who are under the dominion of the Hellenistic successor states, and who may in fact have been, and usually were in fact, Syrian, Armenian, Babylonian, Egyptian, a few Greeks, all kinds of different peoples. So really when we say Greek or Hellenistic, we mean persons living in the Hellenistic world, whatever their ethnic origin may in fact have been.
Yeah, that's important to expand that with regards to medieval astrology, for instance, because when you speak of medieval astrology, generally dealing with Arabic astrology. But the word Arabic doesn't mean Arabian or done by an Arab. It means written in Arabic.
Yeah, exactly the same situation.
Written in Arabic. And in these Arabic sources, which are as likely as not to have been written by a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim in Arabic, there frequently are references to the ancients and to the Babylonians and to the Egyptians. And those terms, Babylonians and Egyptians, can strike one initially as being reference to pharaonic Egypt, for instance, on the one hand, or to Nebuchadnezzar and his crew in Babylonia. But actually, as often as not, in fact more often, what they are references to the survivals of the Hellenistic representatives of each of those cultures. For instance, the Nabateans for the Babylonians. The Chaldeans are as often the Nabateans or the Sabians or even people who were related actually to the Persian area as much as anything else. And with the Egyptians as well. It's the Alexandrians and the Hellenistic Egyptians that are actually referred to in these texts.
Yeah. You'll discover that whenever Mr. Zoller speaks here, the conversation will inevitably circle around the issue of the Sabians. One way or another, it'll come up, and for not unimportant reasons.
Well, what difference does it make? We're talking about all of this historical information, but what difference does it make? How does this relate to astrology as we know it today?
There's a very interesting phenomenon that occurred in the 17th century, mostly on the continent, but to a large degree even in England as well. And that is the almost death, or the zombification perhaps, of the astrological tradition. And what that meant was that people just stopped, large numbers of intellectuals just stopped practicing astrology and didn't perpetuate the traditions. So that when astrology resurfaces in the mid-19th century, it resurfaces, first of all, in a much more watered-down form, in a severely cut back and pruned back sort of manner, and in an entirely different kind of society from the one that it had last been in. In the 17th century, the people who were your astrologers were classicists who were fluent in Greek and Latin and Hebrew. Often, also, they were expert mathematicians, often as not. Many of them were physicians, and they were the cream of the crop, as it were, from the point of view of the intellectual community. In the 1850s and up to the 1870s and to the turn of the 20th century, it's the common people who increasingly have access to astrology because a certain form of astrology is being published and made available to them, not requiring, first of all, not requiring the classical languages at all, second of all, not requiring much in the way of mathematics. So the result is that the astrology that most of us trace our lineage back to in the 20th century is this simplified astrology that was made available to the European readership in the 19th century, necessarily cut back because the people who were going to be the new astrologers didn't have the kinds of backgrounds that they would have had to have had in order to get into this older stuff.
Rob, you have a wonderfully succinct formulation for the relationship.
The reservoir, you mean?
No, the one about the relationship of modern astrology to classical astrology.
Oh, yes. My formulation that he's referring to is that modern astrology is to sun sign astrology as ancient astrology is to modern astrology, that it is almost that large a gap between them. Another issue, too, about the 19th century revival is that astrology, throughout its entire history up till the near death in the 18th century, had a very powerful philosophical matrix. It didn't go around wondering what the philosophy and theoretical bases of astrology were. When it resurfaces in the 19th century, it is only a practical art. It has no philosophical or theoretical basis in anything. And in fact, all of the things that it implies fly in the face of the prevailing one to a phenomenal degree. So astrologers go around like beggars looking for some raiment to borrow to clothe themselves in. So what they do is they pick up the kind of hybrid Eastern and Western philosophy of theosophy. And I'm not necessarily condemning that, but the fact is that had astrology not lost its philosophical underpinnings in the so-called Enlightenment, this would not have been necessary. And astrologers now have the opportunity to discover the philosophical matrix in which the classical tradition is embedded, and to discover that astrology is not only embedded in a highly sophisticated classical tradition of philosophy, but it is the classical tradition of philosophy in which the whole culture is embedded.
Janet, when you heard that we were doing a great thing like this, you was practicing astrology. What did you think? What did, I mean, you subscribed, right?
Yeah, immediately.
Why, what did you think was so?
Well, what happened, I had gone on a trip to Baltimore to a museum with a friend of mine, and they had some old astrological texts in there under glass. It was like 15th century stuff. And I wanted to be able to read those so badly, and I knew they were in old French. And I knew that I could never translate them. I don't know any language except New Jersey English. And I knew I couldn't learn the language, and I was so thrilled when I heard you people were doing that. Because I read one book on Pacino by Thomas More, and I was so excited about the fact that he knew, I do mainly Jungian astrology, that Pacino was really Jungian. I mean, Pacino knew all about archetypes and psychological astrology, and that's what I want to find out, and I'm just so excited about this project.
Well, I think what Rob was saying is very important, as you quote Jungian astrology, which too many people say they practice,
right,
as if Jung was really an astrologer.
Right.
In fact, this is part of the trying to borrow legitimacy from other areas in which you shouldn't do that. If you have legitimacy,
right,
you have it inside, from within, from a structure, and you have to find that structure. We've lost our structure, and we're looking, we've been trying to borrow stuff saying, this is scientific astrology. Hell, it is. There's nothing scientific about it. Not one thread. And so you have to go back and say, what's it based on? It doesn't have to be based on science.
Yeah.
Although everything eventually should come down to something that you can perhaps quantify to a certain degree. But mainly, you need to have an internal structure. And what we're doing is going back and finding what that original internal structure was. And then let's get into that structure. Is this structure something we can live with? Does this apply in some special way to the structures that we've since created? This was the idea of the building. Now, we've been looking at the plaster and figuring we knew what was inside the wall for the last couple of centuries. And in fact, we really don't. Where are the beams? Where if you try to nail something to the wall, where are the studs? You need a stud finder.
I think the point is here, though, that it's a long time lost, that underpinning. And being so long time lost, being in so many different languages, it's amazing. I mean, the French stuff is something I didn't even guess. I know there was a lot of French stuff, but I didn't think it would be a different form of French. And it brings to mind that perhaps this will have Project Hindsight will have a tremendous impact, hopefully, on archaeoastronomy, giving those people more impetus to look for astronomical information, since there's somebody playing with it again.
I'd like to go back to what Rob said. I think one of the most important things, JW asked, how does this impact, more than just a small group of people seeking scholarly knowledge? If indeed the philosophy was lost when the Enlightenment came and the scientific revolution came, that by rediscovering it and finding that astrology was actually at the core of that philosophy, you are bringing back to the entire world, not just to astrology, the philosophical underpinnings that were lost from everywhere.
Well,
and that we may find that it does a whole lot more than just make astrology a legitimate science. It may give an underpinning to all of modern life that it's desperately in need of.
I'm not sure the philosophical basis, the philosophies rather, let me put it that way, that the philosophies that are at the basis of astrology have been lost. What's been lost is the recognition that astrology had those as their basis, as its basis. For example, as was mentioned a moment ago, when one says one is a Jungian astrologer, one can indeed make a case, and I'm not attacking obviously, that it's borrowing legitimacy. But if you say I'm a Neoplatonic astrologer, you're not ripping off anything, because that was a very major category of astrology. The first book on the Latin tract that we're publishing, the Al-Kindi on the stellar rays that Zoller translated, this man's astrology is entirely Neoplatonic, and he's developed an entire rigorous system of natural philosophy based on Neoplatonism to explain astrology, magic, and all occult phenomena.
What has happened in the philosophic, let me just jump in for a moment, what has happened in the philosophic tradition, and I think it's largely the result of the 19th century, though it may have started in the preceding century, is the systematic, on the part of the academic philosophers, was the systematic excising of any understanding of Aristotle or Plato or any of the ancient philosophers that had anything whatever to do with astrology. It's very clear when you look at medieval philosophers, like Bacon, for instance, that astrology and Bacon's physics and Bacon's Aristotelianism or Bacon's Neoplatonism are not just interwoven with astrology, but that the texts of the originators of these philosophies, Aristotle and Plato, are understood by Bacon and by medieval philosophers as having been essentially astrological. So, for instance, when Aristotle says in Book Lambda, the final cause of every motion is in one of the stars of heaven, this is something that is not, if it's brought out at all in modern philosophical exegesis or teaching, I'd be very surprised at all. But this was one of the keys or links for the medieval philosophers that enabled them to use the metaphysics of Aristotle in the way that you see Al-Kindi using Aristotelianism generally.
But I think Gene has a point here in a different way. I think that we can, through the study of the ancient astrology, we can get a clearer and cleaner view of what the ancient philosophies were. Because to some extent, we study Aristotle, we study Plato, and this has gone through the university systems for 2,000 years supposedly, and it's gotten real stale, okay? And people don't have a fresh view. It's not clear that we understand Aristotle at all, and it's not clear we understand Plato at all. It's not clear that we understand Plotinus at all, just even apart from the problems of translating them correctly. But if you use something that hasn't really been used as a focal point for trying to study even the philosophies, insofar as the astrological material is just sort of embedded in all this kind of philosophy, it might really help to understand the ancient philosophies a lot more clearly than they have been understood by scholars. It's not, if they are inseparable in these people's minds, you can't just say, well, we already know the philosophies on the one hand, and the we can use the astrological project to broaden the understanding of ancient thought in general. Right. And I think that's
the soul.
The soul.
Essentially, the soul was ripped out by the mechanical and industrial revolution that said, we're sorry, there's no place for magic in our modern world. Right. And then you're left with a philosophy that doesn't have its inspiriting center, and so it fades away, and they turn around and say, well, the only philosophy that really counts is how machines work.
Right. But see, that could be part of the broader significance of this project.
Exactly.
People well beyond just astrologers. There may be lots of people out there who would, maybe they don't give a hoot about astrology as a practice, but once they see these foundations revealed, they may find this a wonderfully exciting philosophy. And of course, if they find it a wonderfully exciting philosophy, then they're going to end up being astrologers again. But so it seems to me this is one of the broader purposes behind.
That's an important broad. The philosophical dimension to this is the area really where the project has the most chance of impacting on the society as a whole. Within the astrological community, however, the other aspect that seems to me to be very important is the aspect from, or the argument from technique. That there are techniques which the astrological community at the present time simply doesn't even know about because they were deemed in the 19th century to be too demanding or too questionable to bring forward. And when you look at why they were deemed questionable, they were either considered not to be astronomical. It was very clear that what was happening was that the astrologers had in their mind's eye or in their mind's ear, as it were, they had an astronomer screaming in their ear, you can't do anything unless you can show that it's tied in with actual physical existence in some way. So a lot of the symbolic techniques that were used in the Middle Ages were simply excised because they couldn't be shown to rest upon purely astronomical thought. And this is a shame because they're actually very, as we found by using it, totally usable and more reliable than many of the half-baked attempts to be scientific have been since the 19th century.
One thing Rob and I were finding as he was editing my translation of the Paulus, the first booklet that's out, we can display it here, is the sect issue,
right?
Which is almost ignored in modern astrology. I mean, you are
in modern astrology, totally.
Yes, and that this view is absolutely critical, whether it's a day or night planetary ruler. You can't even begin to even do any astrology until you've made these assignments.
And in fact, the issue of sect, if it turns out to be, if its validity holds up under further examination, could explain why statistical studies of astrology have consistently fallen apart, because not only are day and night charts fundamentally different, they are to some extent antithetical in nature, so that if you take any database and mix up the day and night births without paying any attention to that issue, you may in fact be obscuring astrological influence because you're combining what essentially amount to opposites. So if you have 50% of A and 50% of not A, the end result is neither. It's in the middle.
And will you define what you mean by day and night?
Yeah. Day is very simple. The sun is above the horizon. Night is very simple too. The sun isn't above the horizon. It's not AM, PM. A lot of people make that mistake. But the sun in the houses 1 through 6 is a night birth. Sun in houses 7 through 12 is a day birth.
But the planets are not. If you have a day planet in a night birth, it's not going to behave properly.
Right. All the planets are either diurnal or nocturnal as well, and the diurnal planets prefer to be in diurnal charts, and the nocturnal planets prefer to be in nocturnal charts.
And one of the diurnal or nocturnal forever, it's like being a water sign.
Exactly the same order of significance. It is an essential quality, the diurnal nocturnal, except for Mercury.
Which are which?
The nocturnal planets are Moon, Venus, Mars, and Mercury setting after the Sun. The diurnal planets are Mercury rising before the Sun, Saturn, Jupiter, and the Sun. So you have 3.5 of each. So in the classical planets, it's a perfect balance. As a matter of fact, I think one of the things this really brings to modern astrology is the restoration to the total equality of the masculine and feminine, because the sex of the planets is not evenly divided, but the sex of the planets is. And
mistranslation.
And what?
Mistranslation.
Right. Well,
Gee, that's not quite the way we do our translation, right?
Yeah.
But the one of the key points that is emphasized, well, it's not emphasized, but it's explicit in the ancient texts, is that the moon in a nocturnal chart has every bit of the power of the sun in a diurnal chart. So the two sects are in fact precisely equal, and neither is good or bad. It is value neutral. So you have a chart like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, born at night, moon in the 10th house in Cancer. The moon is on the opposite side of the hemisphere of the horizon from the sun, so the moon is technically nocturnally placed. It's a nocturnal chart. Cancer is a nocturnal sign, and the moon is in dignity. So this moon becomes an incredibly powerful thing in his chart. And this is why he was able to embody the ethos of the entire people as a human being. Because this is what a lunar ruler can do. instead of saying, as Louis XIV did, I am the state, the lunar type will say, I contain within me the state, but the state is the people. I somehow summarize it. I can't think of a neat l'état c'est moi kind of thing, but or l'état c'est nous, or however he said it. But it's almost the other way around. It's a kind of summation and embodiment of the people's will. But it's every bit as powerful. Interesting point. Somebody else who has the same kind of situation is Prince Charles. He has the moon in Taurus nocturnally placed in the 10th house. And this leads me to believe, if there's anything to this idea, that he will not only recover from his current lack of grace, but if he becomes ruler, and only if he becomes ruler, he will become a very popular one, and he will in some way embody England to a degree that Queen Elizabeth cannot, because she has Saturn in the 10th.
He's going to embody the New Age England.
Yeah.
And that's who he is, and he's just waiting for the time to become right to acknowledge that.
Yeah, and that moon can't work until he is the king.
What would you do with the outer planets with the sect issue?
Yeah.
What are you going to do with
How
that?
do we sign that?
Temporarily.
Why do you think I asked the question, John?
Who thinks Pluto is a diurnal planet?
I'll give you my quick one. I think Uranus is diurnal, Neptune is nocturnal, and Pluto is like Mercury. It changes.
Right.
John, I remember you had an opinion about that 8 years ago. What was
Yeah,
it?
I
Did you do the same
completely
way?
agree. After I put the outer planets on top of Lily's, all of Lily's rulerships, and it came out totally balanced. I can't spout it off completely because it was a very complex thing, but everything was completely balanced between night and day rulers of everything.
Yeah.
And it became completely even, and it did revolutionary stuff for what the Almuten of a chart is. You know, I discovered in my case appropriately Neptune, which no one would have guessed. But here I am, you know, a sailor, and spend most of my time doing Neptunian things in a very, you know, Uranus kind of way. And there it was, and it was perfectly clear, and it's all, you know, it's all written down, and it's all based on what people, the way they were viewing it back then, as opposed to now. But I think that one of the things we tend to forget is that we're sort of like lost souls looking for this stuff, because although philosophically in the last 150 years we've abandoned the structural basis for this entire way of thinking, which includes astrology, but it also includes everything else. But this was the way people were thinking during the Renaissance. It was the way Shakespeare thought. The language, we still speak Shakespeare's English. So embedded in that language is all this structure and all this philosophy and all this information. But we've thrown it out the door, but we're still talking. We still move with it. Everything that we do actually reinforces these ideas that we have rejected. So it's like a lost child. We threw the baby out with the bathwater, now we're looking for the baby again, because every phrase we speak, every word we speak, every motion that we move has that embedded in it. And we've forgotten that that's the case. You know, every phrase we say is based on that philosophy. You know, every tautology and stupid repetitive phrase that everybody knows is not based on the scientific paradigm as we know it as a modern thing. It's based on the very philosophies that we're now digging up here with this. So it's getting to know an old friend.
So that brings to mind Schmidt's idea, his insight into Greek, and the nuances that Greek has is so much more flexible. If you go into that just a little bit, because you're finding that the personage, as you were saying, the object, the person, and you speak, and one hears. The description of one hearing is, and the kinds of nuances and information that's passed in their language is so much more, is at such a different level.
Yeah, the one thing that's apparent to me in translating the Greek, for the Greek track, I'm not entirely sure this is a weak question, but this may get to that the astrological concepts in the Greek language are not just separate words, you know, like sign, aspect. They're not just different words altogether. The concepts themselves are interlocked in sort of a very coherent system, or what it seems to me a very coherent system at this point, because I haven't totally figured out what it is. sort of just through the concepts themselves. So you don't just have different labels for different things and then have to make definitions that relate them. The words themselves create a kind of tissue and sort of warp and woof of different connections with other astrological concepts in very, very subtle ways. We discovered this with the first writer in the Greek tract, whose name is Paulus Alexandrinus, and he wrote in the late 300s. And he is considered by the historians of astronomy to be, by the way, a wretched writer. This is a direct quote of Neugebauer. He considers Paulus to be one of those wretched writers along with Vettius Valens. And it's true that Paulus doesn't write real self-conscious Greek. I mean, he's not trying to write a poem in his books. But what we discovered by looking really carefully at how he said things is that there's constant playing on the words. There's constant attention to the ambiguities in the language, and it becomes very confusing for us when we first confront these things, because the first time you come across it, you say, "Oh, he's just making a pun." He's playing on two different possible meanings of this word. It's just a pun. And then the second time you come across it, he's making a pun again. And the third time you come across it, it's a little bit more mysterious. You say, "Well, this is deliberate mystification of some kind." But then, when you find out how consistently this is done, and you sense that there's an order to this sort of deliberate use of equivocation, you begin to think that perhaps this wretched writer is communicating a certain very deep astrological message to you through the interrelationships of the concepts that are there in the language. And unfortunately, we don't speak Greek anymore. Okay, so. That was a really, really rewarding discovery for me, because it makes the effort of translation, which Mr. Zoller here will certainly confirm is at times highly frustrating. I don't know if it's worse than computer programming, but at least it must be in the same league.
It doesn't break in the same kind of way.
It doesn't break. It breaks the translators as well.
Depends on where you see the hardware.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Well, with reference, I now say it's all Greek.
It's all Greek.
Plus kinesis, actually.
Ari, is that still?
Okay, so let's see if I can get anything.
Okay.
Selene, actually. What's the past participle? How do you construct? I mean,
Non computoribus fornicare.
Fuchon. Present active. No, that would be you'd be referring to yourself.
Non computoribus fornicare.
Luna Fortricata-esque.
Well, that was after too much translation.
Right. So what else we got going on here?
Okay, just start jabbering at the computer there. If you see anything, just...
What is this nocturnal diurnal thing here?
Well, sun's above the horizon, diurnal chart.
No, I didn't mean that. I mean, why is everything all screwed up?
Oh, because the moon is above the horizon with the sun. The sun is above the horizon, so the moon is diurnally placed in a diurnal chart, but in a nocturnal sign, so it's got 1 out of 3 possible sec things running in its favor, 2 out of 3 again. Moon is also waxing, which makes it somewhat more diurnal.
Yeah.
Now, it's not applying to a conjunction or anything. Mercury is setting after the sun, so Mercury is nocturnal at this point, and it's diurnally placed in a diurnal chart, in a diurnal sign, so Mercury is triply out of sec. That's interesting in view of the fact that she taught through nonlinear, non-rational means.
Yes, that's right.
Because the Mercury's normal linearity is totally obliterated by its accidental debility.
That sounds like a little bit of modern interpretation.
Well, you have to. Modern interpretation is totally wrong. Yeah, but the Mercury ruling the 10th the way it is, overwhelmingly ruling the 10th, indicates that the normal mercurial functions are interfered with because Mercury itself is not particularly badly placed. It's in its own triplicity, although in the wrong sect. So it's.
Don't you wish you knew what was below the horizon?
Yeah, Saturn, obviously, or unless that's Saturn there. How do you move this thing? Oh, of course. I'll scoop it up. Ye gods! I hate Macintosh mice. You have to drag them across the room to move them.
That does it, huh?
Yeah, let's do it over here. It's easier. That's Jupiter. So way down low,
There's nothing wrong with that.
Saturn the first opposing Jupiter. Okay, so the Saturn, now here we go again. Saturn is a diurnal planet nocturnally placed in a diurnal chart in a diurnal sign. So Saturn is 2 out of 3 insect, 1 out of 3 autosect. Jupiter is 3 out of 3 insect, but debilitated. And of course, Jupiter is the dispositor of the Saturn, so the Saturn is not, this chart actually has a lot of problems.
Now, what is the aspect between Jupiter and the midheaven? Did I see one there?
It's a trine.
Trine
Out of sign trine, I might add, because the midheaven is in Virgo. How far you have to move the mouse before you have to go up the screen? Mercury is trying to be descendant, however. Mercury is the dispositor of the descendant. So,
the dispositor of Jupiter.
right, and also of the midheaven itself. So the Mercury becomes a key planet, and Mercury is what she does for life. But because of the accidental debility, the Mercury has to function in ways that are not entirely appropriate to Mercury. So you get emphasis on nonlinear thinking.
This is the end of the sign.
Yeah.
My eyes serve me right.
2659.
We have midheaven in the terms of the malefics.
Yep.
And fortunately, the Jupiter is mitigating that somewhat.
Yep. By squaring it. Yep.
What's the term of the decans? Of course, this whose decan is this? We're starting from.
Can't remember.
Starting from we have 3 decans times at the fixed sign we change, so we have we're starting again in Leo, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Right.
So we have Mars, Venus, Moon, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, Saturn, probably. Also the term of Saturn, I would.
Good.
Eugene's husband built this house. Oh, really? His first house. Was that his first house, Gene?
It was his first anything.
First anything.
Now we build real houses.
Well, what is this? This is better than a real house.
Yes, it is.
It does have some old. That one, however, is being actually divided up, so I don't have to do an archaeological expedition to get it out.
Yes, I am. You're going to have the cake? That's a good. Here, Kurt, look at the cake. Look at the cake.
Look at the cake.
Yes, look at the cake with lust or something.
Lust?
Now can we do it?
No,
Go ahead and hold it up there for me.
You can't hold it up, it'll fly off the plate.
It's not going to slide off the plate.
Ellen did this.
Turn it up so I can see it.
This tells us that the real motto.
Oh yeah, there we go. Don't walk so hard.
Yeah, food for thought here.
Bouncing everything. Great.
Project Hindsight is food for thought. Okay, you think you got a good enough photograph?
I definitely got it there, Ellen.
Pressed apple cider if you would like that.
All right.
That sounds really righteous.
Oh, your caffeine addiction, let me,
How do you manage to keep your home pressed apple cider from becoming home pressed hard cider by this time of year?
It's freezing.
and when you freeze it, you really can't
If you ever get to the conference from here, I would like to. All right. We do the project first, and then we have the hindsight.
see. Anything else can I get?